What is up, everybody? It's the Stable Lad coming at you again with another DeFi deep dive. Now, I've already done a short dive into InfiniFi, but a number of subscribers have been asking for just a little bit of a deeper look. So that's what this is today. This, as usual, is not a hype piece. I'm not here to sell you this yield, and I'm certainly not here to tell you this is safe or should be added to your portfolio. The goal is simple. Explain what InfiniFi actually is, how it works mechanically, where the yield comes from, and why, despite being thoughtfully designed, I personally classify this in my own portfolio as high risk. Again, not to be avoided, but just classified as high risk, which falls into that specific bucket in my portfolio. So hopefully by the end of this video, you should be able to decide whether this belongs in your portfolio or not, and have a good idea of what InfiniFi does and how I kind of just think about and look through these things in general. So the first thing is that InfiniFi is not just a stablecoin issuer. And the cleanest way that I like to think about it is that InfiniFi is basically like an on-chain bank that is running this fractional reserve system or fractional reserve model without the sort of regulation of a traditional bank, where managing the duration and liquidity risk is basically the entire product. In the previous video that I did, I think I compared InfiniFi to basically an on-chain hedge fund. And I use that analogy to kind of help people intuitively understand the risk of it. But I think that maybe is a little bit misleading, because there are plenty of traditional banks that have failed catastrophically without ever being considered or compared to hedge funds. So it's just important to say that what matters here isn't the labels. What matters is that InfiniFi is doing basically what banks do, funding short-term liabilities with longer-term assets, transparently, on-chain, and without regulators standing behind it. That distinction does matter, and it is thoughtful and definitely intriguing. So let's take a look at the mechanics and the specifics. So essentially, when you deposit your stablecoin, right, you're depositing something like USDC, USDT, Frax over here. You're minting and receiving an iUSD token. It's important to know that iUSD is a receipt token. It's designed to be redeemed for $1. But that stability does not come from holding 100% of deposits in cash the same way that USDC does, for example. Instead, the protocol keeps some capital liquid as reserves, and then the rest is deployed into yield-generating strategies earning higher returns. This basically alone tells me everything that I need to know in one snapshot and how I would categorize this in my risk framework, right? With one snapshot, I know this is just far more complex than just putting money into Aave, for example. Nothing inherently wrong with this at all, but it's just why this falls into my high-risk bucket. Because banks are conceptually really simple, right? Deposits come in and withdrawals go out and reserves sit in between. The complexity and the risk basically live in how those reserves are managed relative to its liabilities. The protocol essentially allocates capital across assets with varying liquidity and maturity profiles. And Infinity explicitly acknowledges that it is running both short-term liabilities against longer-term assets. And deployed capital is not just sitting in a money market. It's often attached to duration-based or semi-illiquid strategies, such as like Pendle principal tokens, for example, and Athena related positions, as well as other yield sources that may not always be exited instantly at par. So none of this is accidental. This is, as you can see, part of its core design. To remain solvent in a fractional reserve system like this, a bank must essentially carefully manage the timing of both its cash inflows and its cash outflows. And this process is known as laddering, as you can see here. in the white paper. And it involves selecting assets that mature in a way that roughly matches the expected withdrawal behavior of the protocol. So effective laddering requires aligning asset maturities with expected liability outflows over time. And this is really difficult and continuous work. And generally, this is where things tend to break. InfiniFi correctly points out here that centralized balance sheet management creates an incentive misalignment between depositors and the decision makers. And the white paper here makes a fair critique of traditional banking specifically. In centralized banks, laddering is managed top-down, and executives design strategies and then employees execute them. And so incentives are tied to profitability and essentially the career advancement of those employees, and not necessarily the depositors themselves, right? It's not for the depositors themselves, it's for the bank, right? And they point out that the global financial crisis made this painfully clear. They do say here, right, which is true, right? Banks are not necessarily fundamentally evil. They simply are inside of a system that rewards risks asymmetrically. What's InfiniFi trying to do differently, right? Their claim is that, and it's a reasonable one, is that by moving this entire balance sheet problem on chain, they are, and also by making it risk explicit and making it opt-in and transparently priced in, that you're reducing that exact incentive mismatch. So risk within the system is explicitly assigned through tranching rather than implicitly done by all, borne by all our participants. So instead of those hidden risks like you do have in traditional banking, the idea here is that risk is tranched, losses are basically pre-assigned, and the high yield that you're making is your compensation for absorbing any market stress. So that locked capital that exists, it exists because it's needed to protect liquidity. So this is not about eliminating risk at all. It's about redistributing it clearly and doing it on chain, which is really, really cool, by the way. This is also really cool. The exit timers and the unwind mechanics are definitely worth discussing for a moment. Locked positions are require an explicit unwind period before capital can be redeemed. So locked capital does not exit instantly. Users have to initiate an exit, wait through this unwind period, and then redeem. And that's important, right? Because it reduces any sort of reflexive panic, forcing capital to move more slowly, and it gives the system time to source liquidity without fire selling its assets. Again, doesn't remove risk, but it changes the shape of it. In traditional banking, depositors can often rush to the exits instantly, whenever they want. And here, the exit friction is trying to be intentional. It's a good design, and it acts almost like a perpetual bond that you don't have to work or manage maturity on. Quick pause here. If you do like this style of breakdown with mechanics first and risk second and no hype, I do all this and much more detail on my Substack. Free subscribers get deep dives into all the frameworks, as well as just my thoughts on stablecoins in general. And paid subscribers see my actual portfolio allocations, position sizing, and when I decide to do something, whether it's sizing something different, get in and out of something, as well as subscriber tools. If that's useful, the link's below in the description. The next thing is really important is DeFi, is depegging and the liquidity risk. It's important to kind of clarify how all that sort of works here. InfiniFi does not define stability by its stablecoin peg or the price on a chart. It defines its stability by its redemptions. And this is a really key differentiator. IUSD is not a traditional stablecoin by design. It's a receipt token. And so one IUSD is meant to be redeemed for $1. Okay, so one USDC. So if iUSD depegs, for example, it doesn't matter because you can still redeem your one iUSD for your one USD that you put in there, so long as the reserves exist, of course. This is important. It's important not to get caught up in the idea of thinking of risk in this protocol as iUSD depegging, because it's just not the right frame to think of it. The real risk here in this protocol is liquidity, not the price. Again, if redemptions accelerate faster than reserves can support and stress shows up, it's not because the token is trading at 88 cents or 76 cents or whatever. It's because liquidity has to come from somewhere. And to be fair, InfiniFi, with regards to bank runs and bad debt, InfiniFi handles these mechanics more honestly than many systems that I've seen or come across. And as you can see, they've given it quite a bit of thought here and consideration. So if you are a staked iUSD holder, your redemptions are prioritized. You're making less APY because your assets are far more liquid. You're not exposed to the market price volatility. You're redeeming against its protocol reserves. That's the upside. So losses are absorbed generally, right? Like you're the second sort of iteration of risk here. Losses are absorbed by these locked liUSD, these locked positions. The trade-off is then what happens behind the scenes, right? If withdrawals spike, liquidity has to come from both reserves or these locked positions, and the locked positions almost exist entirely not to get the extra APY, but to absorb those shocks. So you're paid higher yield because in these positions, in these locked positions, because you're taking on that first order of risk here, the first loss of capital in the event of loss of funds from the underlying yield protocols. This is not a flaw. Again, this is the design itself. So why do these things matter? Why do all these things matter? Because these risks aren't theoretical. They have happened and they will happen again in real life, right? So Silicon Valley Bank failed in 2023 because deposits were short-term and flighty, even though assets, especially because assets were longer duration. Withdrawals forced the asset sales, and the run created their insolvency. The assets didn't go to zero. They had tons and plenty of assets, but liquidity disappeared, so they had to sell those assets in order to fund the liquidity. The same thing happened here, right, with the bank that heralded the global financial crisis. Northern Rock Bank relied on short-term funding to finance its long-term mortgages. So when liquidity dried up, depositors rushed for the exits, and the assets were fine, but the timing wasn't. So again, I just point all this out to note not that the protocol is going to fail, but that this has happened before, and this is not a crypto-specific risk. This is financial history, and it's just important to mention and to think about it here. Another sort of popular strategy here on this protocol, on the InfiniFi protocol, is its looping strategy. And I'm not going to go into doing all this kind of stuff. I'm just going to basically explain how I think about it, right? This looping strategy is essentially you hold your locked liquid position, your locked iUSD, you deposit that into Morpho, you borrow more USDC against it, and then you buy more locked illiquid iUSD, and then you repeat that. So again, interesting strategy if you're comfortable with the risk, but this is not looping stablecoins. You're looping duration risk on top of protocol risk. And as you can see here, right, recursive strategies amplify both returns, but it also amplifies losses. So if Pendle breaks, Athena depegs, Morpho liquidity dries up, or exit fees spike and people are rushing to the exits, losses can become nonlinear here. This is what they call like a glass cannon strategy. It works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, it fails fast and hard. Now, I always like to look at, this is not, the most important sort of risk thing that I look at, but it is something that I do look at. And I look at the builders, the backers, and I try to look at the full context here, right? And it's important to note that the builders are public for this protocol, and the backing is fantastic, right? You've got tons of backing here from folks like Electric Capital. Electric Capital is one of the OG value add investors in crypto that have been around since, I think, 2017, maybe even before that. They do tons of due diligence and before they make any investments, and they're OGs for a reason. They've survived all the stuff. So it matters. It matters in one way in that it increases the probability that these systems are, as we've sort of seen here through this deep dive, they're intentionally designed. That does not remove any sort of structural risk, because good builders can still design systems that fail under stress, but it's just important to mention. So what's my final risk assessment? It's the same as what I mentioned in my previous short dive, and it's what I mentioned earlier in this video. This is a high risk protocol for me. Doesn't mean I won't use it. Doesn't mean I won't put it into my portfolio. It just means that I'm going to size it appropriately. And for things that have protocol risk, like they're newer, they're complex, they're governance dependent, that means it's high risk for me. Asset risk, receipt tokens backed by illiquid strategies like this, or partially illiquid strategies, that's high risk for me. Strategy risk, like complex strategies like fractional reserves plus looping things, these are high risk strategies for me. So it just falls into the bucket that I consider high risk in my portfolio. That means I would deploy no more than 2.5%. That's the max I deploy into each high risk position. But high risk positions do make up a percentage of my portfolio. So this could end up in my portfolio at some time. It'll just be sized appropriately, very, very small. And I'll think of this, I probably wouldn't even put 1.5% in this. That's how low I would size it in my own portfolio. So again, just to point out, InfiniFi is smart. It's thoughtful design. And it's being incredibly honest about what it's doing, listed in its white paper and its light paper and in all of its FAQs. But this is not a savings account. And this is not core infrastructure. This is a structured credit product. Exit timers are cool and they help. The tranching absolutely helps. And the transparency is incredible. It's a very important thing for me. But none of these things make this a low risk protocol or even a medium risk protocol. They just make it a better designed high risk protocol for me. If you want to see how I actively manage my portfolio and how this risk actually, I use it in practice in my portfolio, what I use, how I avoid it, how I size those positions, all of that's over here on my Substack. Again, paid subscribers see my real portfolio, all the moves I make every single week, and any real-time changes, plus all the subscriber tools, such as my DIY protocol design that's should be coming out in a week, this week, as well as other tools such as my cheat sheets and guides and all that kind of stuff. So if your goal is to make yield without blowing yourself up, Substack is where it's at, and that's all in the description. Till next time, stay stable, my friends. I'm the Stable Lad. I'm the Stable Lad. And if you like today's video, please hit that subscribe button. Every week I break down what's happening in the world of stablecoins and why it matters, clearly, calmly, and without the hype. This channel is for educational purposes. It is not meant to be financial advice. So always do your own research and manage your risk wisely.